not forgetting. Thanks for checking in. Anybody got, before I start, anyone got a contract issue, transaction issue they want to share with the group? A question? Experience? Okay, well, I'll jump into what I've got for this week. We had a transaction that where these particular paragraphs of the RPA came into effect. So we're in the RPA paragraph 14 and subparagraphs F, G, and H. So what happened here was we're representing two different agents representing a buyer. One's representing the buyer, one's representing the seller on a property. So we're dual agents with two different agents. The agent representing the seller, you know, our buyer is an escrow and was attempting to get a certain type of loan. It turned out that loan couldn't be obtained, so they changed gears and reapplied for a different type of loan. So their timeframes were getting extended on the loan side. They were reaching their deadline and they didn't have loan approval yet. So, and then, you know, we're 17, 20 days into the escrow, the seller gets a second offer through our listing agent and a different company. We aren't dual agents, and it's a better offer than the first offer by, I don't know, $10,000, $20,000 or something. So the seller is saying, well, I want to take that offer. And so now the buyer, you know, our agent representing the buyer says to the buyer, you know, they aren't going to extend your contingency here. You know, what do you want to do? And they felt, the buyer felt confident enough to remove their contingency, even though they didn't have final loan approval or final appraisal on the second loan application, because the appraisal on the first loan application came in at value. And they were in the process of getting the appraisal on the second loan application. So they decided, well, we'll just remove that contingency and move forward with the purchase. So that triggered, you know, a conversation around this 14F, the effect of the removal of contingencies. So F1 says the removal of buyer contingency. If the buyer removes any contingency or cancellation rights unless otherwise agreed, buyer shall conclusively be deemed to have completed the buyer investigations and review of the reports, elected to proceed with the transaction, assumed all liability, responsibility, and expense for the non-delivery of any reports, disclosure, or some of the seller's control, blah, blah, blah. So the buyer has the right to remove the buyer's contingencies. The RPA called for the buyer to have an increased deposit upon removal of all contingencies, so they had to move forward and put in their increased deposits. So that was all kosher, and the notion came up that, well, since they removed the loan contingency, they have to show that they have enough cash to buy the property. And it didn't change the terms of their ability to get the loan. So really all they had to show was that they have the down payment, not the cash to complete the purchase as a cash sale, because they were still entitled to get their loan, even though they removed it as a contingency. If they failed to get the loan and close on time, then other consequences happen. And that's what triggered FG, because now it appeared that because there was a new loan, the buyer might go beyond the closing date that was specified in the RPA. So what happens then? Well, that triggers 14G, which is the demand to close escrow. So that says, before the buyer or seller may cancel this agreement for failure for the other party to close escrow pursuant to the agreement, buyer and seller must first deliver to the other party a demand to close escrow, and that DCE shall be signed by the applicable buyer and seller, and give the party at least 3 days after delivery to close the escrow. A DCE may not be delivered any earlier than 3 days prior to the scheduled performance date for the close of escrow. If a DCE is incorrectly delivered, it specifies a time less than the above time frame, the DCE shall be deemed invalid and void. So from the buyer's side, they said, well, you know, the property is supposed to close on the 12th, I think it was, and that happened to be a Saturday. So when they receive it, remember how we count days. The day you receive something is day 0. So Saturday is day 0. Sunday is day 1. Tuesday is day 2. Monday is day 2. Tuesday is day 3. They would have to close by Tuesday to be in compliance if they got a DCE from the seller. Now the seller has the right to give the DCE 3 days earlier prior to the scheduled day of performance. Now the scheduled day of performance was the 12th, which was a Saturday, but you couldn't perform a closing on Saturday, so the closing would be pushed to Monday, and 3 days prior to Monday is Sunday, Saturday, Friday. So on Friday they could have given them a DCE, and they would have had to close on Monday. But and I'm not sure how that all came out. I talked to the agent representing the buyer today, and they said everything was going okay. So they pushed very hard, and I think they're going to be able to close on time. So this DCE won't come into play, but we did discuss it. And then, you know, if the buyer failed to close escrow, a DCE was filed, and the seller canceled, then it triggered H, which is the effect of the cancellation on deposits. And that is if buyer and seller gives written notice of cancellation pursuant to the rights duly exercised, the parties agree to sign and deliver mutual instructions. If the parties, you know, and then it talks about the release of the funds that are in escrow, the liquidated damages. If the seller were to cancel the contract under the DCE, I don't believe they'd be entitled to the deposit. That might be spelled out somewhere else, but my recollection is thought if they elect to cancel for their own benefit because they're going to take another offer that's higher priced, that they wouldn't keep this buyer's deposit. Anyway, we had to go through all those clauses to see how the buyer could kind of maneuver their way through the contingency expiration and the possibility that they couldn't close on time. So that was interesting to kind of read into the details of those paragraphs. That's always, as Bill always says, you know, we can solve most problems by reading the fine print. Any questions on that? Okay, there was another thing that came up while we were having that discussion, and it was paragraph 13. And the buyer's agent's asking me, well, you know, the buyer hasn't received the title report yet, so don't they still have, wouldn't the contract be extended because they haven't gotten the prelim, and that time period would extend until they get it? Well, 13A actually addresses that. So it says buyer shall, within the time specified, And in this case, I think that time was 3 or 17 days, whatever is the default in 3N1. Be provided the current preliminary report by the person responsible for paying for the title report. Well, in this case, and in our area, the buyer is generally the one responsible for getting the title, paying for the title report. And so that falls into the buyer's lap to get that. So they can't say, well, I didn't get it, it's the seller's fault, because it's the responsibility of the buyer. So that theory that the buyer's agent was trying to kind of chase for a automatic extension didn't work, because that is the buyer's responsibility, and they can't say extend it because they didn't do what they were supposed to. Any questions on that? Okay. Moving on to a different area. I know we've covered the COP form numerous times in this training, and thank you all who have showed up repeatedly and probably could tell me about the COP as well as I can describe it. But we did get into a transaction this week with the COP where the buyer was making an offer subject to the sale of their property, and the agent wasn't so familiar with the form. So I wanted to go over some of the particularly dicey areas of that form, because I do think it's probably the most complicated form that we deal with periodically. And that, along with the seller financing addendum when there are is seller financing. So let's look at the COP form. And I won't spend a whole lot of time on this because, like I say, many of you have we've covered before in training, and many of you are familiar with it. But I want to cover the particular parts that were questions to this agent who wasn't familiar with the form. So starting with paragraph 1 of the COP, it says buyer's property contingency. This agreement is contingent upon, and there's three options here, A, B, and C. So A is the buyer entering into a contract for sale of and closing on the buyer's property. That's the one that's most favorable to the buyer, because not only it's subject to them selling the property, but it's also subject to closing the property. B here says only entering into the contract for the sale of the buyer's property. So if it's contingent upon the sale of the buyer's property, the sale goes through, they get into escrow, but then it cancels. That's a different can of worms than if it were number A, 1A. And C is only upon the close of escrow, and that would be mean when they are coming to the table with the property already in escrow and is just subject to closing. So those are the three options, and in this case, the buyer chose 1A, entered into the sale of and closing on. Okay, and then we jump down to the always interesting paragraph 7, which is backup offers. And here's this clause is all about the seller being able to receive a backup offer. They want to accept that backup offer. They can give the buyer notice, and within 3 days, that buyer has to remove this sale contingency and provide proof of funds sufficient to close on the transaction without the sale of the property, which is very difficult if they were trying to sell the property. So the default is that the seller could give immediate right to notify the buyer anytime after acceptance. So they accept this offer, and 5 days into it, they get a backup offer they want to accept. They give the buyer 2 days notice. The buyer can't perform. They can cancel that contract and take the backup offer. Option 2, C2, is a delayed right for no earlier than 17 days is the default, which usually matches the inspection period and the default on some other contingencies in the RPA. But anyway, the default is 17. It could be 20. It could be 30. Whatever the parties agree to. But then the seller couldn't give, even though they got a backup offer, they couldn't give the buyer notice to remove the for that period of time. And C3 is no right to give the buyer a notice. So the seller shall have no right to invoke this 7B during the entire term of the agreement. So 1 is in the buyer's best interest, 3 is in the seller's best interest, and 2 is kind of a compromise. When I was explaining it to the seller the other day, I said, a buyer, wants a fair chance to be able to perform under this agreement. So 17 days is deemed to be kind of a fair chance to get the property in escrow. And um, and then close in conformity with the agreement. So a compromise position for that form. Here that is interesting to me is 11 A and B, and 11 A and B have to do with A has to do with the starting of other contingencies in the contract. That the default is they'll start as written in the agreement, as if there were no COP at all. And the check mark here, the option 2, is that they will, the contingency and their loan contingency and so forth, will start on the day the buyer delivers the seller the escrow evidence that they sold the property. What was interesting, which I really hadn't highlighted before, was the time periods here. The time periods in the agreement for inspections, contingencies, covenants, and close of escrow and other obligations, excluding those in the addendum, shall begin as specified in the agreement, or check the box upon notice that they've sold their property. So in this case, let's say the agreement was written up with a 60-day close of escrow. This box is checked that the close of escrow will be postponed. The counting of those 60 days won't start until the buyer delivers escrow evidence that they sold the property. So let's say they reach agreement. This box is checked. 15 days into the escrow, buyer provides evidence of the sale of the property. 60 days from then, the closing date would be. So that extends the original, what we thought would be a 60-day closing to a 75-day closing. So in the conversations I was having with the seller last week, or this week, they wanted a 60-day close. So we had to counter out that 11A is okay, check with this checkbox, excluding the close of escrow date, which will remain 60 days from acceptance. So that kept the buyer under an obligation to not only sell the property within the time frame specified, but close within the original 60 days specified in the purchase agreement. So if you don't counter that out, you're basically going to automatically extend the escrow by that period of time that the buyer takes to sell their property. This same thing, this clause on the B, it has to do with the deposit. Most buyers are going to kind of make their deposit anyway, because it's good faith that they have some money in the escrow and not delay that until they sell their property, unless they're totally out of money and they don't have any money until they sell their property. But typically you would want to see the COP buyer go ahead and put their deposit up when the offer is accepted. Any questions on that? I'll take a pause here. Okay, Amy ran off to a home inspection. Good luck, Amy. Questions on that? Again, a CLP form is complicated. If you're going to be using it, just make sure to go over it very carefully with your clients. So another form that came up in this particular transaction is the TOPA form. There were rental units on the property. And back here and find the TOPA form. So the buyer wanted the units, the rental units on the property delivered vacant. Well, that's all well and good. Under the TOPA, they could put that in there. That's an option. Pull this up here. Okay. So they attached this form and they left it as one, and they didn't want 1A, which is the tenants to remain in possession and the buyer shall take subject to the rights of the existing tenants. They didn't want that. They wanted the property vacant. So they checked 1B here, property to be delivered vacant. Okay. So we're in a position where, the seller doesn't want to vacate the units because if the deal falls through, she then has no tenants and she can't pay her bills, is what she says. So, and there's the form I'll go to next, which is the RCJC form, the rent cap and just cause eviction form that may restrict the seller from vacating the tenants as well. So if the seller agreed to this and the seller, after exercise of good faith attempts and subject to applicable laws, unable to remove the existing tenants by close of escrow, the buyer may cancel the agreement. The buyer may elect to proceed with the transaction, or the buyer may elect to proceed with the transaction. So, those are the kind of options under the TOPA. And then there's additional terms that the buyer is staying in contract or is staying in place and so forth. So that got offered along as an attachment to the RPA. Now let's look at this rent cause or the RCJC form. Because it's I wasn't totally familiar with it, I have to admit. We don't get that many properties where the single family home has rental units on it. So we don't kind of get involved with the RCJC that often. And what I learned in discussing it with Bill Jansen, our risk management counsel, is this form has a whole lot of teeth. So this is a notice from the housing provider, which is the landlord, to the tenant. That's who signs this. And just skipping over the rent caps requirements, just causes for termination of tenancy. And there are at-fault reasons by which the seller could give the tenant a notice to terminate. Term of the lease, maintaining, permitting the nuisance, committing waste. The tenant has a written lease that terminated and they didn't move out. Criminal activity, assigning and subletting premises, the tenant's refusal to allow the owner in it, using premises for unlawful purpose, and the tenant fails to deliver possession of the residential unit. So what's missing from this number one here? At fault reasons. That a landlord could give a tenant notice to vacate. What's not there that you might think is there? Anybody? Well, the answer is the sale of the property. Just the fact that the seller is selling the property does not give that seller the right to terminate the tenancy. So how's that stack up against the TOPA? Not very well, because the buyer is asking them to deliver it vacant, and the seller doesn't have a reason or a just cause to vacate the tenant. Now, there are other no-fault reasons that the tenant might be occupied, asked to terminate. That would be the intent for the new owner or the owner or their spouse to move into the property. So an owner that's going to move into the property and vacate the tenant, that's okay. The withdrawal from the premises from the rental market. The owner may terminate the lease at the end of the fixed term or any term of month to month by giving the appropriate notice if they're going to take it off the market. But if they're going to keep it on the market and let's say this new buyer is going to try to rent it out, then that's not a good reason. Unsafe habitation. The government says you can't live there. That's a good reason to vacate the tenant. And the intent to demolish or substantially remodel. So there essentially is no good reason in the case we have right now for the landlord to give notice to the tenants to vacate. No good reason for the new buyer to they couldn't vacate the tenants either because they don't have a just cause. So it's something that landlords and tenants have landlords in particular have to be aware of if they're trying to sell their property that have rental units. So this was kind of news to me. We're still working it out now. The tenants can voluntarily agree to leave the property, vacate their tenancy. Well, what would be a reason they would do that? The landlord offers them money to do so. Bill, who does, some of Bill's clients and so forth are in San Francisco. He said that he's heard of circumstances in San Francisco where the landlord paid in excess of $50,000 to have a tenant vacate a property. Now, I don't know what kind of property it was, how much they were paying in rent, what the intent of the landlord was, but that's an awfully big sum to have to pay to get a tenant out of the property, and you've got to have pretty strong motivation to do that. The property we're working on where the numbers are quite a bit less, I think the total rental on this property is like $2,500. I don't know. We haven't tested the water, but we may be testing that soon. And that is, we may the buyer may offer them $10,000 to vacate. So they, 4 months rent or something, if they would vacate prior to closing. So that's yet to be determined, but that's negotiable. And it's negotiable whether the seller pays that or whether the buyer pays for it. I think the way our current transaction seems to be going is that the buyer may increase their price to give the seller additional money at closing to pay the tenants. The landlord would pay the tenants now to vacate on the closing, and they would get the money on the date of the close of escrow. Have the additional proceeds, the seller's proceeds. So that's yet to be determined. I'll give you an update when I have it. Any questions on that? Okay. Couple other issues that came up this week. One of our agents is going to hold an open house on another one of our listings that's listed by another agent within our brokerage. She wanted to make up flyers with about the property with her photo and contact information on the flyer. So when people came through the house, she could hand out the flyer with her contact info. And that's quite okay from a GRE administration point of view. We can't do open houses for another brokerage. We talked about that.
You're breaking up.
You're breaking up.
But we can do,
Gary.
but they, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm getting a notice that my internet's unstable.
I, di-
Maybe
I
let me
didn't get
trim you
all of
over
what
here.
you were,
Please.
Okay. Hold on a second. Mary, you done? You done? Hold on a second. Mary, you done? Okay, I'm trying another location here. Is that any better?
Yes.
Okay. So we're talking about flyers for agent holding another agent's listing open. So the agent should get approval from the listing agent to do that, you know. But as long as the listing agent says, yeah, that's fine, hand out your own flyers, then that's okay. Okay, I forgot my cheat sheet, but I know I wanted to cover the CA form. So let's go back to zip forms and look at the CA form. That's the commission agreement form. So the circumstances surrounding the use of this form that we that we encountered this week had to do with our agent representing a buyer in a mobile home where there was a new mobile home. Now, new mobile homes are represented by people called mobile home dealers. And like going to a new home subdivision, they usually don't have cooperative agreements with cooperating agents, a buyer's agent bringing in a buyer. They would pay a referral fee, maybe. And in this case, the mobile home dealer had a policy that they would pay $1,000 finder's fee to a buyer's agent, and that's it. Now the transaction was in the $200,000 range. So a typical, no, it was a 200,000. Yeah, the typical commission, let's say the commission was 2.5%, then that would be $5,000. So the finder's fee is only being offered as 1,000. So the buyer's agent, who'd worked with this buyer for a while, I think they had a BRPC, buyer broker representation agreement. And so they went over the situation with the mobile home dealer. The mobile home dealer says, well, you've done a lot of work. We'll increase what we'll pay you to $2,000. So, and then the buyer said, okay, well, I'll pay the other $3,000 to you directly. So the agent ended up getting the $5,000 partly from the dealer and partly from the buyer. So they used this form, which stated out who the principals were. And in this case, the principals were both the buyer and the mobile home dealer. And they agreed to pay the broker. In this case, it was $5,000, it was a flat amount. Not 5,000%, sorry. $5,000, you put it here. Oops, and in there, but that's all right. Oh, there it is, $5,000. And then they just down in this area, the terms and conditions said that 2,000 or 3,000 to be paid by buyer, 2,000 to be paid by dealer. So that's how this form got used in this case to confirm that we were going to get paid for the transaction and who was going to pay what. So that's a good use of this form in those circumstances. Any question about that? Okay, I don't have my list in front of me, but I think that was basically everything I had to cover today. There might be one item I'm skipping. If it's important, I'll cover it next week. Any questions? Okay, well, we'll get out of here a little early today. Enjoy the sunshine wherever you are. I hope you have sunshine. And we'll talk to you next week. Have a good week.
You too.
You.
Thanks.